Hi, today we're going to be talking about how to use questions effectively as you teach your classes or your lessons. So the first question I have for you is, what is the purpose of asking questions? Well, I can tell you what it's not. So often we as teachers fall into the trap of just thinking, I'll ask a question and hope that it fills the time and hope that somebody answers and they ramble and everybody takes a turn and all of a sudden the time is gone. And that is not why you want to use questions. The time you have to teach is valuable, and I guarantee that as you teach from the general conference talks and as you get into them, you will discover that you run out of time. So you don't want to waste it on a useless question. Okay, so what do we do with the questions? What is their purpose? It is to help engage the class. It is to invite them to share their experiences, because as you know, when other people share, we all learn a lot more. We can sometimes learn more from what somebody shares than what we teach ourselves. So we want to make sure we invite class members to share. It connects them to us, it connects them to each other, and it invites the spirit. It also, when we ask questions, it also lets the class members know that you as a teacher care about them. You're interested in them. You're not just up there spouting what you know or what you think, but you're involving them, and it links them to you and to what you're teaching. So those are critical components of questions. In Teaching in the Savior's Way, we have a quote that says, inspired, note that, inspired questions give learners opportunities to share insights and ponder how doctrine applies to their lives. That quote basically encapsulates everything we want to accomplish with our question. It's inspired. We can't be inspired if we're not going to the Lord and asking for help. So you need to pray for help in asking your questions. And it's more than just asking your questions. I like to be very specific in my prayers when I ask for help about questions. And the first thing I ask for is help to know what questions will be most helpful for those in my class to be able to learn the doctrine and hopefully actually apply it in their lives. What they need to do to make it apply to them. Okay, so that's the first thing about which question is most helpful. Second is, how should I phrase the question to help it be purposeful and contribute to the lesson and to the purpose of the lesson? And third, I ask, is there a specific person in my class to whom I should ask this question? Because sometimes that makes all the difference. So I recommend to you that you employ something like that. You'll probably find ways of asking yourself, but be specific, because I promise, as you are specific, the Lord will specifically answer you. And we know from President Nelson that because good inspiration is based on good information, I'm going to give you some additional tips. We're going to cover 4 things you can do. We're going to talk about engaging, making the questions engaging, safe, emphasizing the principle, and how to respond to their responses. All right, because I guarantee if you will employ these tools, and just know this is not an all-inclusive list, it's just some tools to get you started. If you will employ these tools, then your questions will be fantastic. And they will keep you from having the situation where you ask a question and nobody answers. You just hear those crickets. You've been there, right? Either you've been in the class or you've been the teacher, and that's so awkward. So we're going to keep you from being awkward, because not all questions are created equal. So here we go. First, you want to start with a question that is engaging, and you do that by avoiding the ones I just talked about. So stay away from questions where the answers are either super obvious or they're the primary answers, right? We all know what those are. If everybody in the room knows the answer, you don't need to ask the question. It's not going to move you towards your purpose with that lesson. So stay away from those. Sometimes the primary answers are important if you craft a question that leads them to that and it leads into something that you really need to talk about. But typically, that's not required. So as a general rule, I just stay away from those. Another type I stay away from is the yes or no. And they're not necessarily bad, but typically a yes or a no question, unless it is framed in a way to get the class to think deeply, and then they might reply yes or no in their own minds. Other than that situation, a yes or no question, again, really doesn't move you toward your purpose in the class. So I would stay away from those if you can. So what you do want to do, those are the don'ts, what you do want to do is you want to make the question personal to them. A lot of times when we phrase questions, we'll say, we all know, or how do we serve the Lord, right? And we use we. Now we's okay, but you is better because it makes it one-to-one. And when I'm sitting in a class, I'm thinking about it in my mind, about me and how it applies to me. I'm not thinking, oh, how do we all answer this question? I'm thinking about how do I answer this question? So you try to use the word you when you phrase your question. Let me give you some examples, right? So you might ask, why does attending the temple matter to you? Now that's a pretty simple question, right? Instead of saying, why should we attend the temple? Those are very different questions and they elicit very different answers and different thinking, right? So why does attending the temple matter to you? When I work at putting you into my questions, there's a couple things I ask myself. The first question I ask myself is, why does it, let me say that again. Why does it, or why should it matter in their lives? And when I say it, I mean the principle or the doctrine that we're teaching, okay? Another question I ask myself is, if they apply, or if they choose not to apply the principle, what would it look like in their life? How would their life be different? So, like, if you were to ask a question about that, I might say, if I apply these principles to help me get greater personal revelation, how would my life be different? If I'm talking about President Nelson's talk about revelation, right? So I'm going to ask them a question that says, if I set aside a time and make sure that I write down the inspiration I receive, how will that change my life? So you notice I included something specific. I talked about how they would apply it in their life by writing it down and setting aside a time, and then asked how it would make their life different, if that makes any sense. Okay, so work on asking yourself those questions and then use the word you, okay? As you do this, you also want to include specifics and not generalizations. So, for example, you could ask, how are you doing at living right? Living right is a phrase that was used last October conference 2019. So you could ask that question. That's very broad, right? It doesn't really help. What does it mean to live right? I don't know. And they're trying to figure out what living right means instead of what the question really is. Instead, you could ask them, how much time and effort do you put into getting ready for your day? So already you're going to the morning and what you're doing for your morning routine, right? Then you follow that up with when you physically, right? So that refers to physically getting ready for the day. And then follow that up with, and what kind of time and effort are you putting in to spiritually getting ready for the day? Do you see how crafting those questions makes it entirely different than simply asking, how are you doing at living right? So make it personal, make it specific, add the word you into your questions. And then to engage them further, be sure when you ask the question, if someone raises their hand, call on them by name. Look at them in the eyes and call on them by name. If you don't know their name, that's okay, but work to learn it. Try to learn the names of everyone in your class. And that can be hard because some of the classes are, 5 people, and some of the classes are 45 people. And so if you're in one of those really large classes, it's okay to say, I can't remember, could you please tell me your name? and then have them answer. There's a lot of different ways to go about learning to know your people and remembering their names. And I'm not going to cover that today, but I definitely recommend that you research that a little bit. All right, moving on. The second thing you can do to make your questions effective is make sure that they are safe. People want to be in a safe space to learn. They want to be in a safe space to share. So what you don't want to do is ask quizzing, what I call quizzing questions. In other words, these are questions where there's either a right or a wrong answer. And they may know the answer, but they don't want to say it because they are afraid of being judged, either by you or by their classmates, or just in general because they have trauma from their days in school, right? So avoid a quizzing question such as, what did President Oak say about family situations after death? All right, how many of you, when I said that, had a little tiny bit of a heart attack? Right? You feel like you're being pressed and judged. So stay away from questions that are basically asking for specific information. The only reason you would ask a question like that is if you actually have the answer on the board in front of them, right? Then they can answer it. But honestly, that kind of falls back into the obvious answer category, so I still don't recommend it. All right? The second thing you don't want to do to keep the safe space, avoid making assumptions or generalizations. In other words, what did our state president remind us to do last week at state conference? That assumes, one, that they were there at state conference, and two, that they remember everything he said, right? It's another thing where you're testing their knowledge and their righteousness or anything like that, okay? So stay away from those. It would be better to say something like this. Those of you who were able to attend state conference may remember that our state president asked us to pray morning, evening, and often in between. How might you be blessed by following his counsel? So you see, by using that question, you actually referred to conference, you supported the state president, you retaught what he had taught, and then applied it to their life. So questions can be very effective that way. All right, another way you can make it safe is how you respond to their answers. This is a big one. People are offering you something. They are being vulnerable when they answer your question. And you know, most all of us know, that teachers are literally begging people to answer questions. So if you want them to offer up their response, you have to respect what they're giving you. And you do that by responding respectfully. And we're going to cover that later when we get down here to response. All right, but make sure that you respond gracefully and respectfully to every comment. The other thing you want to do is share, not maybe every time, but occasionally, share your own answer to the question you ask. This can be done if there is a lull and they're not really answering, or this could be done to simply introduce the question. So I might say, when I asked myself how reading the Book of Mormon changed my life, I was surprised to realize that I actually haven't been putting in the effort I should into the Book of Mormon. Does that then open it up for other people to be vulnerable, to share their weaknesses? When you open up your own soul and your struggles, you give them permission to do the same. And you create a safe place for them to share. And honestly, that is when the best discussions have happened, when I have been vulnerable and allowed other people to do the same. And you know what happens? Is we connect, we support, we encourage, and other people share their experiences and how they've grown and what they've learned, and it becomes a tremendous learning experience, and it's very motivating. So do not be afraid to share your answer to the question that you either just asked or that you are about to ask. And if you do answer it, it doesn't always have to be your struggle or your vulnerability. It can be something else as well, but don't be afraid to share a little bit about you. All right? And then just know that if you are safe sharing, they will be safe sharing. And keep that in mind. All right, the third thing you can do, and you should always do, is make sure that your question emphasizes the principle you are teaching. This is so important. This is what allows questions to move the lesson forward. It allows it to move the discussion forward. It deepens our thinking and it engages the class. So you need to stay true to the principles and the doctrine that you are teaching and that are being taught in these general conference talks or in the other lessons that you're teaching. So as you phrase the question, you know you already have you as part of the formula. You also want to add a part of the principle, right? Use some of the wording from the principle. So, for example, you could ask, have you found Christ this week? If so, where did you find him? Or where did he find you? That then gives them the word you, right? It makes it personal, and it teaches or re-emphasizes the principle of finding Christ or being found by him. Here's another example. Have you felt connected to Christ this week? If so, how did that connection come about? Was there something you did to initiate it? So once again, we're using the word you, and we're reinforcing the principle of connecting and putting forth the effort to connect to Christ. All right, the next thing you can do is ask yourself, what is the desired thought or action that the question is eliciting from the class? Or what is it pointing toward? So I ask myself this question, again, as I'm working on emphasizing the principle. I ask, will this question help the class members think more clearly about how the principle applies in their life? If the answer to that is no, then you don't need the question. If the answer is yes, then you can move forward. All right? So for example, how would reading the Book of Mormon with the intent of finding Christ on every page change your experience? So we know that that is pointing not only toward reading the Book of Mormon, but being more intentional about finding Christ on each page in the Book of Mormon, and that reading the Book of Mormon can change our lives if we allow that to happen, right? So a question could do a lot of things if you're very careful about how you craft it. Okay, moving on to number 4, how you respond. This one is a big one. It's so huge, and I know I already mentioned it when we were talking about being safe. But your responses, if you're in tune, if you're teaching with the Spirit, and the Spirit is brought into the classroom, what you will discover is that the people in your class are responding in a manner that actually moves your lesson directly where it's supposed to go. I can't tell you how many times I've asked a question at the beginning of the class or toward the beginning, and we discuss it for a little bit, and then somebody gives me a response which naturally leads perfectly into the very next part of the lesson. It's like magic or Spirit, right? So if you respond in respect and gratitude, people will be more free to reply and to answer your questions, and they will be guided by the Spirit as they do so. One of the things you need to do for sure is acknowledge every single comment. Everyone. There's nothing more deflating than when you offer up a comment and the teacher turns their head and immediately starts into something else. It's like they didn't even hear you. They don't care what you said, or it didn't have any value. So you need to acknowledge every single comment, and you validate them by doing that. You validate that you heard it, you validate that you appreciated it, and if you don't have something readily to respond with, you can always just say, thank you for sharing. And that's good enough, but always respond. All right, the next thing is, in your response, if you can, restate what they said. In their response, if you can, restate what they said. Because again, that validates to them that you were listening, and it helps others in the classroom that maybe were not able to hear their response. Plus, it allows you to emphasize the principle again. So do your best to restate. In the restating, if you can agree with them and praise them, that is fantastic. For example, you might say something like, "You're exactly right. The Book of Mormon is powerful." Right? So you just emphasized the principle and you praise them and thank them. Good job, right? All right, if by chance they make a comment and part of it maybe needs to be corrected a little bit doctrinally or perhaps socially for the other people in your class, this can be tricky. The best thing you can do is be kind, and I'll admit there have been times when people have been responding and I have literally prayed, "Help me to know how to respond to this. What do I do here?" And the answers have come and the words have come. So be kind. Try to find something positive in what they said. Pull out a piece that worked. And then work into the correction without making it obvious that it was an issue that came from their comment. So for example, I might say, "Yes, we do have agency to choose what we do on the Sabbath day. And as our leaders have admonished us, we should be prayerful and carefully consider the message we want to send to God through what we choose." So do you see how I acknowledge, yes, we have agency. So in other words, we have a choice of how we spend the Sabbath day. So that's a correct principle, depending on how they say it. You can imagine what the answer was, right? How they responded. And then I emphasized what our church leaders had taught us about that, and hopefully did it in a way that was not demeaning or derogatory or pointedly directed at that person. All right, and then you need to manage time. Because as you know, when you open up the room to questions, or you open it with a question and you open it to responses, there are some people that are going to be quiet all the time, and there are other people that are going to talk, and they'll keep talking for 5 to 10 to 20 minutes if you let them. So you have to take your role. You are in charge of the time. You are the timekeeper. And in order to maintain that, some things you can do to help are to set a time frame. So if you're looking at the clock and you know you're winding down and you don't have a lot of time for the question, you can simply say something like, "In the next 2 minutes, I would love to hear what all of you think or what some of you think about," and then ask them a question. Okay? Then you've given them the time and they know what they're working with. And so if they go overtime, you can say, "Thank you so much. I'm sorry, but it's been 2 minutes and we need to move on." You already told them that was going to be the case, so they don't need to be offended or worried, right? You can set the time limit. Another thing about time is you don't need to worry if nobody answers right away. It's okay to wait and just be patient and be still, because probably they're thinking deeply. If they're, "Wait a minute," you may have asked a really awesome question and they've got to think about it. So give them a little bit to think. Give them, 10 to 30 seconds if need be. If then nobody is responding, you can just kind of feel the silence. Then, 1, you might need to rephrase the question and try again. 2, you could share your answer to the question or your experience. Or 3, you could simply say something like, "I can see that maybe this is a question we each need to ponder on our own. Maybe do it later or longer." And then you move on. But you're in charge of the time, and it's your job to stay within the time. So hopefully these tips are helpful to you. Of course, there's many, many others, and you can find a lot of them on the church website under Serve and Teach, and then under Teaching in the Savior's Way. There's a lot of other resources as well. But I hope you will try to practice crafting really great questions, because I guarantee it will change the experience as a teacher and for those in the class. And above all else, whatever you do, pray for help and invite the Spirit to guide you. I promise that He will.